If you picked up a copy of the New Testament and a pair of scissors and just started snipping away, cutting out huge chunks of scripture to make your own shorter version, you might attract some criticism. Thomas Jefferson would know. And this is also essentially what the early Christian bishop Irenaeus accused a man named Marcion of doing, creating a scriptural hack job. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus wrote that Marcion was the only one who had dared openly to mutilate the scriptures. Marcion was an early Christian leader who, within around 100 years after the death of Jesus, launched a Christian movement that scholars now call Marcionism. His movement quickly spread across the Mediterranean world, reaching as far as ancient Persia and lasting at least until the 400s and 500s CE. Marcion's followers revered him for his practice and teachings of self-denial, but he was a lightning rod for criticism. Around 150 CE, the early Christian theologian Justin Martyr called Marcion an old man with teachings inspired by demons. Writing a few decades later, Irenaeus was the first to depict him as a foundational heretic. Later, apologists added new details and insults that grew more and more vivid. By the end of the 4th century, the bishop Epiphanius shared a tabloid story that Marcion had fallen from his practice of sexual abstinence and seduced a virgin. According to his critics, Marcion taught there were two gods. First, there's a transcendent God of pure goodness and love. This God, according to Marcion, is revealed through Jesus Christ and offers salvation and grace. Then there's a lower God, a demiurge, a God of punishment who created the material world. This God, according to Marcion, is the God of the Old Testament. His critics said that Marcion thus rejected everything in the Hebrew Bible, saying that the Jews confused this lower God for the good transcendent God. Marcion's critics like Tertullian also accused Marcion of teaching that Jesus was not truly human and did not take on physical flesh, as this would associate him with the corrupt material world created by the inferior God of the Hebrew Bible. But a lot of the criticism focused on his collection of scriptures, accusing him of butchering the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul, stripping them of passages that did not align with his theology. By all accounts, Marcion's New Testament was very different compared to the New Testament that we know today. Today you'll find 27 books in total, including 4 Gospels and 13 letters attributed to Paul. By comparison, Marcion's collection only had a much shorter version of the Gospel of Luke and only 10 letters of Paul, which also may have been shorter than the versions that we know today. Although his critics were scandalized by his shorter collection, ironically, Marcion's canon represents the earliest known attempt at creating a New Testament, an authoritative set of Christian scriptures. So what made Marcion's Gospel different from the Gospel of Luke that you can read today? First of all, several ancient sources agree that Marcion's Gospel did not include the birth stories of John the Baptist or Jesus. These are major stories at the beginning of the canonical book of Luke. In other words, no Christmas story, no Mother Mary, no surrogate Father Joseph, no census, inn, angelic choirs, or shepherds. Instead, Marcion's Gospel apparently opened with Jesus descending from heaven into the city of Capernaum in Galilee. We can imagine something like the Son of Man figure in the book of Daniel, coming with the clouds of heaven. Marcion's Gospel is also missing a lot more stories mostly or entirely unique to Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, as well as the story of the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Other stories missing from Marcion's Gospel are shared in common between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, such as the baptism of Jesus, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and the cleansing of the temple. This sounds like a lot of missing stuff, so what did Marcion's Gospel actually have? First, it's helpful to have a quick refresher on the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from the Greek words for together and appearance or sight. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because, in distinction from the 4th Gospel of John, they have a lot of overlapping material. They tell many of the same stories, such as Jesus' temptation, his exorcisms, parables, and transfiguration. By contrast, most of the stories in John are not found in the Synoptic Gospels. So we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic because, unlike John, they tell many of the same stories. Marcion's Gospel apparently had a lot of overlaps with the Synoptic Gospels. Some of the stories are shared only with Luke, such as the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who climbed up a sycamore tree to catch a glimpse of Jesus. In a lot of places, Marcion's Gospel overlaps with both Luke and Matthew, including most of the sayings in the first sermon of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, and lots of other pithy ethical teachings. In other places, Marcion's Gospel overlaps with all 3 Synoptic Gospels, including an eclectic mix of teachings, miracles, controversy stories, and other shared details, like the brief trial before Pontius Pilate, a basic description of Jesus' crucifixion, and the burial of his body by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. So you might be wondering, how the heck can I know what's in Marcion's Gospel? It's not like I can go to a bookstore today and buy it. Well, Marcion's Gospel is at the center of one of the biggest debates in early Christian studies right now. The traditional scholarly position actually aligns with early Christian apologists like Irenaeus, arguing that Marcion's Gospel was a later abridged version of the Gospel of Luke, and that Marcion cut out sections that did not align with his theology. probably not with scissors. Scholars have also generally assumed that Marcion's Gospel is irretrievably lost. After all, no complete manuscript of it is known to exist, and we only know about it from ancient Christian authors who really hated Marcion and criticized him as a heretic. However, throughout the last decade, over a dozen scholars have started arguing the opposite, that Marcion's Gospel is a provably earlier version of Luke, that the canonical Luke was a major rewrite and expansion of Marcion's Gospel, and we can recover its contents through a painstaking restoration process, sifting through ancient attestations and variants found within manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke. This would be absolutely huge for the study of the New Testament and our understanding of how Christian scriptures first formed. So how can we reconstruct Marcion's Gospel? Well, a lot of scholarly debate is being hammered out over the details, not just at the level of entire passages, but down to individual sentences and words. Scholars working on this reconstruction rely on several types of evidence. First, quotations and paraphrases of Marcion's Gospel from his opponents. As the scholar Dr. Mark Bilby points out in his open access book, The Gospel of the Poor, Marcion's Gospel is attested over 700 times by 15 ancient Christian writers. Sometimes these writers quote Marcion's Gospel word for word in order to refute it. But for scholars today, these are valuable fragments to piece together his original text. One example is the early Christian writer Tertullian, who frequently references Marcion's Gospel in his 5-volume attack against Marcion, titled Against Marcion. Another notable source is the 4th century apologist Epiphanius, who wrote out entire passages of Marcion's Gospel word for word in his work The Panarion. Even though these are very biased sources, like these were very anti-Marcion guys, we can make a reasonable assumption that they had a copy of Marcion's Gospel in front of them for reference. Another key source of evidence that scholars use to reconstruct Marcion's Gospel are variants found in the surviving manuscripts of Luke. When you flip through the Gospel of Luke in most modern translations today, it's very easy to forget that the text on the page is based on what's called a critical edition, a reconstruction created by scholars who analyzed all of the existing manuscripts of Luke and recreated what they believe is the most likely original form of the text. But the manuscripts of Luke are not all the same. They include a wide range of differences or variants. These variations might be as small as a single word or phrase, or as significant as entire passages being left out or included. Each of these manuscripts represent a snapshot of how Luke's gospel was copied, edited, or interpreted over time, and by comparing these differences, scholars attempt to identify earlier layers of the text that might resemble Marcion's gospel. The goal is to uncover clues about what Marcion's Gospel might have looked like by tracing the evolution of Luke's text and finding points where they might overlap. So hypothetically, if a manuscript of Luke matches a quotation of Marcion's Gospel, we might be reasonably sure that the passage appeared in Marcion's original Gospel, even though no manuscript of Marcion's Gospel survives today. Much of what we know about these textual variants comes from the meticulous work of the New Testament scholar Matthias Klinghardt, who spent years analyzing manuscript connections and arguing for a complete reassessment of Marcion's Gospel as early as 2006 and 2008. All this to say, reconstructing Marcion's Gospel is kind of like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, but it's not just one puzzle, but a jumbled mix of 10 different puzzles, and you only have a fuzzy picture of what it's supposed to look like, and you don't even know exactly how many pieces it's supposed to have. And while the evidence often aligns nicely, there's plenty of disagreement, both in the ancient sources and among modern scholars' reconstructions. 8 major editions of Marcion's Gospel were published over the last 200 years, but these were difficult to compare because every scholar took an idiosyncratic approach and often embedded their own editorial feelings into the texts, making them hard to read and almost impossible to correlate with each other. So Dr. Mark Bilby essentially engineered a cipher to turn these editions into mutually consistent digital data, doing so in a series of peer-reviewed journal articles. So now it's possible for the first time in history to get a statistical handle on the scholarship and see just how much scholars disagree both at a granular and aggregate level. While the first major Greek reconstruction by the scholar August Hahn in its current digital form is over 14,000 words long, the scholar Adolf von Harnack's influential work is only 4,300 words long, and the scholar Jason Badun's version is 7,200 words long. That's a huge amount of disagreement about what can and cannot be reconstructed. For that reason, the scholar Dr. Mark Bilby set out to normalize this data, using custom rules to transform all the different reconstructions into consistent data types. This allows researchers to identify patterns and filter out biases to provide a more objective approach to reconstructing Marcion's Gospel. Okay, that's a lot to throw at you, so here's one example. Dr. Bilby found that the word people, the Greek laos, occurs 36 times in the canonical Gospel of Luke, but it occurs only 1 time in witnesses of Marcion's Gospel. This would be a highly unusual statistical distribution if Marcion's Gospel and Luke have the same author. Like, what are the chances that Marcion, holding a copy of Luke and armed with his scissors, would only snip out the word people so many times? But this would be a predictable distribution if canonical Luke is a later rewriting and expansion of Marcion's Gospel. To drive this point even further, the canonical Gospel of Luke as it appears in modern Bibles is meant to be read together with the Acts of the Apostles, which is kind of like a sequel to Luke, and most scholars today argue it was edited by the same person who edited Luke.
This same word laos appears 48 times in the book of Acts, but only occurs 14 times in Matthew and 2 times in Mark.
This suggests there may have been an earlier version of Luke that lacked the heavy use of the word people, and that the canonical books of Luke and Acts that we have today represent a later editorial expansion by an editor that used that word a lot. An even more striking disparity is the Greek word pros, or unto, which by Dr. Bilby's count occurs only 6 times in Marcion's Gospel, appearing every time with verbs of motion, as in moving toward or to something,
whereas it occurs 166 times in Luke's Gospel,
typically and characteristically to introduce speech. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Marcion's Gospel, Jesus typically speaks to a person. But in the Greek text of canonical Luke, Jesus habitually speaks unto a person, using that Greek word pros. This subtle shift of a Greek preposition is what linguistic scholars call a function word, a word that has little lexical meaning on its own, but serves to express grammatical relationships between other words in a sentence. And function words are sometimes very useful in detecting an author's writing voice. In other words, function words like pros act like an author's fingerprint, revealing subtle patterns in their writing style and helping us identify whether a text has been edited or written by a different author.
If pros only appears 6 times in Marcion's Gospel, but 166 times in Luke's Gospel, there's a strong argument that Luke is an expansion of Marcion's Gospel, or some other earlier version, and this word is a distinctive feature of that editor.
When Bilby queried this word in the datasets based on other scholars' reconstructions, he found this underlying pattern confirmed in some of the datasets. Bilby has identified dozens of other features that show similar patterns of divergence. For example, when compared with canonical Luke, Marcion's Gospel has very low frequencies of personal names, place names, chronological terms, emotional terms, and architectural details. The scholar Marcus Vincent has also found and confirmed many of these same patterns working separately on Marcion's scriptures for years, and recently published the word variations in a concordance. Now these scholars are all working together along with computer scientists, both to confirm underlying data patterns and to use them to refine reconstructions of Marcion's scriptures. One recent addition to the team is Lance Lotharp, a grad student in statistics at Columbia University who has written a custom algorithm that effectively filters out overlapping data between Marcion's texts and the canonical texts. This interdisciplinary network of collaboration continues to grow, with several recent publications already available and several more on the way. So let's return to the hypothetical scissor-wielding Marcion. Was he an ideologically driven editor, cutting out stuff from the Gospel of Luke that did not align with his theology? Scholars like Jason Badun came along and were like, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. In 2012, Badun published the article, The Myth of Marcion as Redactor, which challenged the traditional narrative that Marcion deliberately edited the Gospel of Luke to fit his agenda. Badun argued that this assumption lacks substantial evidence and more reflects the polemical opinions of Marcion's opponents than historical reality. Instead, Badun argues that Marcion transmitted the texts largely as he found them, and that this shorter version of Luke represents an earlier textual tradition rather than a deliberate revision. One of Dr. Badun's key points is the shaky foundation of the ideological editor theory. This theory mostly relies on the testimony of guys like Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Epiphanius, who were writing decades, if not centuries after Marcion. These men lacked direct knowledge of the versions of the scriptures that were circulating in Marcion's day. To quote Dr. Badun, none of them knew anything about the state of the relevant texts in Marcion's time. Therefore, their testimony on this question is wholly without merit. These accusations often assumed that the versions of Luke and Paul's letters in their own communities were the original ones, and that Marcion's versions were the corruptions. In other words, Tertullian accused Marcion of chopping down Luke, but really what he is saying is that Marcion retrospectively appeared to have chopped down the version of Luke that Tertullian was using in his own community. But Tertullian's assumptions ignores the fluidity of Christian texts in the mid-2nd century. Modern studies have shown that many gospels and many forms of those gospels were circulating at the time. For example, check out this recently published fragment containing sayings of Jesus. It dates to the mid-2nd century, which makes it one of the earliest Christian manuscripts ever discovered and corresponds to the tail end of Marcion's life. The fragment contains verses that partly correspond to the sayings of Jesus found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and the Gospel of Thomas, but they're not perfect matches. The verses are just slightly off. The scholar Candida Moss thinks this might mean we're dealing with a fragment of a previously unknown gospel, but at the very least this fragment gives us a glimpse into the fluid nature of Christian scriptures in the 2nd century, a time when Christians were writing and circulating different versions of the sayings of Jesus before they were canonized. I'm not saying this is a fragment of Marcion's Gospel, but it is evidence that different variations of the Gospels were floating around, and variations in Marcion's Gospel that were once thought to be attributed to his own editing scissors also appear in many manuscripts of the canonical Book of Luke and the canonical letters of Paul. So for example, Marcion's version of the Book of Romans apparently didn't have the final 2 chapters, chapters 15 and 16. But there are manuscripts of Romans that are also missing those chapters. The fact that a shorter version of Romans was circulating suggests that these differences predate Marcion, and were not necessarily the product of him cutting them out of the book. More likely, he was transmitting a different version of Romans, perhaps even an earlier version. Another example appears in the story of the healing of the paralyzed man in Capernaum that appears in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In this story, Jesus is teaching in a crowded house, when a group of men bring a paralyzed man to him. They can't get through the crowd, so they climb up onto the roof, make an opening, and lower the man down on a mat. Seeing their faith, Jesus first forgives the man's sins, which prompts some criticism from the scribes who think only God can forgive sins. To demonstrate his authority, Jesus then tells the man to get up, take his mat, and walk, and the man does. According to Tertullian, Marcion's Gospel, when referring to the man, uses the simple noun for someone afflicted with paralysis, paralyptikos, or paralytic, which is the same word used in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. The canonical Gospel of Luke, though, uses an elaborate and sophisticated participle, the one who was paralyzed. However, manuscripts of canonical Luke do exist with the simple noun paralytic, found in Mark, Matthew, and Marcion's Gospel. In the same story, the Gospel of Luke says the man was lowered on a little bed, or klinidion, while Tertullian says Marcion's Gospel says he was lowered on a krabaton, or mat. But this same word krabaton does appear in a version of Luke preserved in the Codex Bezae, one of our oldest complete manuscripts of Luke. These examples suggest that variations in Marcion's Gospel are not the result of his edits. They may actually reflect an alternate version of Luke that was circulating during his lifetime, maybe even an older version. Another reason to doubt that Marcion was an ideologically driven editor is the inconsistency of his supposed edits. For example, Tertullian criticizes Marcion's Gospel for omitting references to God as the creator or to Jewish prophecy. Verses like this should supposedly contradict Marcionite theology, that the creator God is an inferior being and that Jewish prophecy is confused about who the true God really is. However, Marcion's text still includes passages that refer positively to Old Testament figures like Abraham and Moses, and even quotes the Old Testament authoritatively, which contradicts the idea of a systematic purging of Jewish elements. As Dr. Badun writes, either Marcion was an incredibly inept editor, or he had not actually undertaken the editorial purge that Tertullian and Epiphanius presume he did. And we shouldn't be all that surprised that verses contradicting Marcion's theology would appear in his gospel. As Dr. Badun explains in a recent interview, Marcion didn't need to cut and paste his own version of the text. Like many interpreters throughout Christian history, he could just simply reinterpret or explain away verses that don't fit his view. Instead of editing the text, Marcion likely approached the text as is, with a theological lens, emphasizing interpretations that supported his beliefs and downplaying or reinterpreting those that did not. This approach would allow him to present the gospel as consistent with his ideology without resorting to physical redaction. These inconsistencies in the traditional portrayal of Marcion suggest that his gospel was not the product of heavy-handed ideological editing, but rather reflected a different line of transmission. In other words, Marcion may have adopted a pre-existing text that was circulating in his community. Dr. Badun proposes that Marcion's Gospel and the canonical Book of Luke could both derive from a common proto-Luke, with differences arising from the independent evolution of these texts in different regions. Ultimately, Dr. Badun's analysis reframes Marcion as a conservative transmitter of a different version of Luke, rather than a radical editor. Now, scholars agree on the general lists of similarities and differences between canonical Luke and Marcion's Gospel, like how Marcion's Gospel apparently lacks the birth of Jesus. But simply listing these differences doesn't really capture what's at stake. For example, if Marcion did indeed remove the birth story from a copy of Luke, then these stories were much more likely to have originated in the 1st century. As in, it would mean he probably had a 1st century copy of Luke in front of him that he then edited. But if Marcion's Gospel is earlier, that means that a version of the Gospel of Luke was floating around without the birth story, which might mean that it's more likely that the birth story was developed later, perhaps even into the 2nd century. And in fact, some scholars have argued that the story was crafted in part to undermine Marcion's belief that Jesus descended from the sky. Scholars such as Marcus Vincent and Joseph Tyson have argued that the birth story was specifically added to Luke to counter Marcionite doctrine by emphasizing that Jesus had a very human birth. Given that the birth story in Luke also provides most of the material we have about the Mother Mary and what a big deal Mary is to later Christian devotion, you might see how this might be controversial. The debate over the origins of the birth story and whether or not Marcion was an ideologically driven editor also ties directly into a larger critical question. How did early Christians begin defining what counted as scripture? Marcion's work marks a pivotal moment in the history of Christianity. He's the first Christian we're aware of to create an authoritative New Testament canon. By collecting and canonizing texts, Marcion set a precedent for later Christian communities, forcing them to define their own scriptural boundaries. Recent scholarship challenges us to reconsider Marcion's legacy, not as a heretic who corrupted scriptures, but as an early canonizer, who may have preserved an important strand of early Christian textual tradition, and who may have sparked a response that eventually led to the New Testament canon as we have it today. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this overview of Marcion's Gospel and why some scholars think it may preserve an older form of what later became the canonical book of Luke. Now, this is a major debate in the field of New Testament studies. I'm an outsider to this debate. I studied Christianity in the late Roman period, but I know a lot of people in the field of New Testament studies, and from what I can tell as an outsider, it appears to be the minority position, but I think it's fair to say that it's been gaining steam in recent years. Now, Dr. Mark Bilby is one of the scholars working on this topic, and he helped me make this episode. He wrote the initial drafts of the episode, and he guided me through the data science behind how scholars reconstruct Marcion's Gospel. That said, this video is not meant to be the final word on the debate, but rather an introduction to the topic and the arguments involved. My goal is always to present scholarship as clearly and as accurately as possible, and collaborating with experts really helps to ensure that. Now, Dr. Bilby is also a content creator, and there are two places where you can find his public scholarship if you want to learn more about Marcion and this debate. So first, check out the channel Patristica. Patristica is hosted by the scholars Jack Bull, Mark Bilby, and Marcus Vincent, and you can find regular episodes on early Christian history as well as Marcion in particular. You can also check out Dr. Bilby's personal channel, Voces Antiqui, where you can find deep dives into the process of recovering ancient texts using data science. This video was also edited by Lachlan Davis. He's another biblical studies scholar and a content creator over at his channel Tablets and Temples. Now, I bring all this up because Religion for Breakfast has grown beyond just me. It started as a solo project, but it's now a collaborative effort with scholars and editors helping me to bring each episode to life. For example, my recent video on Buddhist atheism involved input from 3 different scholars of Buddhism. And all of this, researching, writing, consulting experts, all of this takes time, effort, and resources. And that's where our Patreon community comes in. As of writing this episode, we have 727 patrons on Patreon. If you're one of them, please say hi in the comments. I am so thankful for each and every one of you. This kind of in-depth, expert-driven content would not be possible without you. There's really no better way to support Religion for Breakfast. I was a very early adopter of Patreon. It was founded in 2013. I joined in 2014, so I'm on what's called the Patreon Founders Plan. So even though Patreon has raised their fees over the years, I've been grandfathered in with their original rate. So Patreon takes a 5% cut. 95 cents of every dollar you pledge goes directly to Religion for Breakfast. By comparison, YouTube memberships takes a 30% cut, so there's really no comparison. So each and every one of you who have supported Religion for Breakfast on Patreon, you have played a vital role in enabling this channel to thrive. Google ad revenue fluctuates wildly from month to month, sponsorships will come and go, but our Patreon community is always there providing a stable revenue floor. This enables me to make editorial decisions. I don't need to worry about ad revenue tanking. I don't need to worry about whether a video will go viral or not. It lets me choose niche or complex topics that might not do super well on the YouTube algorithm, but are still very important to cover. So thank you to each and every one of you. Our goal for 2025 is to reach 1,000 supporters on Patreon. So if you believe in our mission to boost religious literacy, and if you feel that we bring quality content about religion to this platform, please join our Patreon community over at patreon.com/religionforbreakfast. Depending on the tier, you can gain access to our Discord community. At the $10 tier, you'll get the exclusive Religion for Breakfast mug. Only a few hundred people in the world have this, and you could be one of them. Your support directly contributes to creating these videos and invests in the future of Religion for Breakfast. So to everyone who has supported us on Patreon, thank you so much. Thank you for continuing to believe in our mission to improve everyone's religious literacy. And if you'd like to join us, head on over to patreon.com/religionforbreakfast. Thanks, everyone.